Hey, cell group folks, it's Tim Mayer, Executive Pastor here at Canyon View, and just want to let you know that real men do wear pink. So we're going to dive into this week's Daniel series. I hope you're all enjoying this book of Daniel, but before we get started, I wanted to remind you of what to expect during our time together. We'll spend a few minutes talking about this week's chapter, and then move on to a few questions, which I hope will guide your discussion time as a group and make for great interaction with what God is doing in your life through this series. The book of Daniel has some pretty epic stories, one of which happens to be this week's chapter. So let's dive in. As we look at chapter 3 in the book of Daniel, we find a fiery test for Daniel and his two friends. King Nebuchadnezzar decided to make an idol of gold and ordered all the people of Babylon to worship this idol. Not only did he order them to bow down to worship the idol, but if they didn't, there was a hefty penalty. They would face capital punishment for their rebellion against the king's edict, a death sentence. So now we find Daniel and his two friends faced with a critical decision. Do they bow down to this man-made idol, or do they stay true to God's command to not worship any other god? Knowing that the consequences of their choice was life-threatening, their healthy fear of the living God outweighed their personal threat of death. When they are confronted by the king about their decision not to bow down to his idol, they delivered a beautiful and faith-filled response, which we can read in Daniel chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." In other words, they trusted their lives totally into God's hands. They were willing to submit to the Lord's will for their lives, no matter the cost. They believed that if God wanted to deliver them from the fiery furnace, he had the power to do that. They also knew that if God let them perish, there would be an eternal reward for their faithfulness. Now, as Christians today in America, we may not be facing the threat of death by worshiping Jesus instead of an idol, but we may have idols in our lives that we bow down to every day. Now, an idol is a false image we build up that takes place of worshiping Jesus as the Lord in our hearts. It can be an idol of popularity, of being accepted by our peers, of appearing to be successful, an idol of having it all together, or it could be an idol of seeking fun and pleasure. Or how about this one? An idol of money. Anytime this idol is threatened, we bow down to the pressure to maintain that idol at the cost of bowing down to the living God. It's imperative that we understand the cost of these idols in our lives. It's life and death, folks. It's the same commandment that Daniel held fast to by not bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar's idol. It just might look a little different for us today, but the consequences remain the same. We know the rest of the story by now. They didn't bow down, and the furious king had them thrown into the furnace to be killed. But God came through for Daniel and his friends. He even visited them in the fiery furnace and delivered them from the flames. The king even witnessed this amazing miracle and responded in Daniel 3:25 and said, "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." So later the king said in Daniel 3:28, "Praise the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." Pretty impressive, huh? What we see here is God used the flames and the intended punishment to bring glory to himself. What we see is Daniel and his friends found deliverance through God's presence. It was in the furnace and in the midst of the flames, when all hope seemed lost, that's when the Lord showed up. Isn't that true in our lives today? When we are faced with similar choices, we can bow down to man-made idols that only turn up the flames, or we can turn to our living God and place our lives totally into his hands. That's when he shows up and brings his deliverance through our flames. This is how faith gets perfected in our lives. Yes, it's painful, but it's necessary. So James 1:12 says, God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterward, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. May you stand your ground in the midst of trials of your life and draw closer to God's presence so that your faith will reward you with the crown of life. God will bless you for not bowing down to the idols of your life. Man, that's a great story of faith, isn't it? So now we're ready to look at some questions from what we've just learned. I'm going to ask a question. We'll put it on the screen, and then after I read the question, there'll be an opportunity for you to pause the video. Give everybody in your cell group an opportunity to answer and discuss it, and then when you're ready, hit play and move on to the next question. Make sense? All right, here's question 1. Our culture is obviously different than the culture in Daniel's time. But what does it look like to stand up for your conviction in today's culture? What are some specific things that you feel you should stand up for and why? Pause the video here, discuss it, and when you're ready, push play. Okay, moving on to question 2. And this one might be tough for some of you. Recall a time in your life where your obedience to God was conditional. For example, I'll follow you, God, as long as my life is easy. What do you think that said about your faith at that time? Pause the video here. When you're ready, push play, come back for question 3. All right, last one. What circumstances in your life right now have caused you to struggle with obeying God's word? What are you doing to keep your focus right? Pause the video, come back, and we'll finish up this section of Daniel chapter 3. Well, hey, I hope this was a great discussion time for you guys. Thank you for participating, and I know that God will honor your commitment. I really want to encourage you to keep reading the book of Daniel. Isn't it cool to think that the majority of our church is reading through the book of Daniel right now together? Don't forget, we have broken each chapter down into daily chunks, and you can find them laid out on the back of the bulletin and on the Daniel page of our website. Keep praying and being open to what God would want to do in your life during this series. Have a great week. Love you guys. We'll see you.